And we're recording. Okay, let's look at the syllabus here real quick. So here things are. I'll remind you that I moved this chapter 7 quiz, which was originally due on the 24th. That was due just now. I will accept it late, of course, with just a minimal penalty if you haven't turned it in yet, but that was due just now. Wednesday of this week, you do have Master and Emissary quiz. A quiz that I will be posting this afternoon will be chapter 8. So we definitely have a string of days with quizzes here. Chapter 8 will be a week from today. Then you only have 2 more Master and Emissary quizzes. So you'll have one next Wednesday and then the Wednesday after that. And then that's it. If you haven't noticed, we're not actually reading the entire Master and his Emissary book. We're just reading some of it, like 2/3, I would say. The parts that we're not reading are the parts that are most relevant to some of those bigger picture speculations. I'll say a little bit more about that. These bigger picture speculations, for the most part, in Master and his Emissary, have to do with, he makes these claims about the nature of each hemisphere and how they've evolved over time. And then he kind of connects the differences in the hemispheres to these different things in Western society. He talks about different aspects of Western society, like one that comes to mind, money, for instance, is one aspect of Western society, which he talks about. And he talks about how the hemispheric differences and their evolution are related to some of the characteristics of Western society. So that's one of the that's one of the probably the biggest big picture kind of speculation, the biggest picture idea in the book. He also has some speculations about how hemispheric asymmetry is related to some clinical conditions, including schizophrenia. And so the chapters that we're not going to read, that we'll read some of them, like the ancient world and Romanticism and the Industrial Revolution. These are 2 chapters which are focused in on some of those bigger picture ideas. There are other chapters, though, that we're not going to be reading about these bigger picture ideas. And I do want to encourage you, if you're doing option number 1 for your paper, where you have to focus in on some of the bigger picture ideas, you have to connect your topic, the thing that you choose to focus in on, to some of the bigger picture ideas in the Master and his Emissary. I do encourage you to maybe browse some of the other chapters. I mean, you don't have to. You can write this just with the subset of chapters that we read in the book. But you can browse some of the other chapters for inspiration, especially regarding some of these bigger picture ideas, connecting some of the brain findings and the claims he makes about the brain, some of these bigger picture things regarding society and mental health. Some of the bigger pictures. You can use chapters that I didn't sign for that, for sure. And that's a good thing to do. They don't have to. I just wanted to mention that. Now, while I'm talking about, I also mentioned that I did grade over the weekend some of the extra credit. I think I graded like 14 extra credit things related to the Master and his Emissary. And I will encourage you, if you haven't turned one in, to go ahead and turn them in. I gave feedback. I tried to give feedback for every single person who turned one of those in. I read it and thought about it and tried to give you as constructive a feedback as I can. Some people I didn't give feedback if it was just looked solid. There was nothing really to say needed improvement. Some people would just get the full 2 points, and that was that. For individuals, though, most people I provided some feedback, something that needed to be improved on, and that is a very good thing. You can resubmit those if you want, and I can give you the remainder of the points for anyone who didn't get the full 2 points for the extra credit. If you kind of think about it more and can and can kind of fill it out, especially where I suggested you can get the remainder of the extra credit points. It's also a good topic to talk to me in set up a Zoom meeting, and we can talk about it. And I can give you, if you come prepared, you have good questions, we have a productive conversation, then I could just give you the remainder of that extra credit points via the conversation that we have on Zoom. So encourage everyone to do the extra credit thing. And for those individuals that already turned it in, please take a look at the feedback. I tried to be helpful regarding that. I didn't get to making the Master and His Emissary lecture for, let's see, what's next. The next one to make will be Language, Truth, and Music. I didn't get to making that over the weekend, in case you're curious. I was reviewing an article for psychomusicology, and I just did not get to making the video. But I really, really should get to making that this week. I will point out that regarding the deadline, the paper, Master and His Emissary paper, is still due over a month away. So I do want to get that the lectures, like I need to get lectures for these. I'll probably combine them into 1 or 2 videos, these 3. I do want to get those out to you so you guys can use them. And we still have over a month until the paper's due, so I'm not too worried about that. Any questions or comments about upcoming assignments, things like Master and His Emissary, the extra credit? Any questions or comments there? Okay. The goal for today, oh, we do have one. Can you send a draft of a paper is a question. You can send a draft, but I'm not going to read the entire thing and give you feedback on the entire thing, because these things take me a long time to grade and to read. Usually I literally am spending an entire week doing nothing but grading these after the semester ends. And I don't really have time to do that for everyone during the semester where I'm giving feedback. So I do want to be as helpful as I can regarding your paper. So you can send me a draft of the paper, but I will only provide feedback if you ask specific questions about it. Like, I'm worried about my introductory paragraph. I don't know if this is what you're wanting, or referring to me. You don't know if that's what I want in the introductory paragraph, or you don't know if if the claim you made, if the quotes that you're making are helpful, things like that. If you have specific questions, I can address those, but I won't just give general feedback for the entire paper. But thanks for asking that. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I do encourage you to get feedback from me. I just want you to have thought about what are the things that you're worried about? What are the things specifically that you think you need to talk about in the paper? And as usual, if I find that I think you've put a lot of thought into, you're preparing a meeting with me. Like if you're worried about specific aspects of your paper, you're concerned about specific aspects of your paper, and you come to talk to me about those, I'm much more likely to just give you general feedback. The more I see that you've specifically tried to kind of be efficient and specific and to the point, the more I'll come to you with kind of just general feedback and, kind of read through the paper and just give you general feedback, which I know a lot of students want. Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Anything else, people? I don't see anything. So probably should get going on here to chapter 6. So we'll doing some lecture stuff today on chapter 6. And that's it. We'll only get to chapter 6. Oh, I guess one more thing about the syllabus. I think I mentioned this before. We will almost definitely not get to chapter 12. And so I will likely be canceling this chapter 12 quiz. I mean, it depends on how we're going through time-wise for the rest of this stuff. These classes are taking a little bit longer than I planned, which is fine because you guys, something I never did before is using the chat feature to allow you guys to ask questions, but that's been fun for me and I think fun for you. I like answering the questions that way. The classes take longer than I planned because of that, but I like it. So we'll probably be axing chapter 12 there. So just a heads up, we probably won't have that quiz and we probably won't be lecturing about it. So today we are talking about chapter 6, which is right here. So we started this last time, Wednesday, I believe. And I've mentioned we've been now on part of this 2-part series of chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 6. Chapter 5, which we're done with, was mostly about the sensation side of things, the bottom up side of things, the input side of things. So sensation, to remind you, is kind of like the beginning of the process. It's the taking in of some type of information which is out there in the world. Sensation is the beginning of that process, and it involves the 5 senses. We went through in chapter 5, we've talked about the receptors for each of the 5 senses, and we talked a little bit about some of those early brain regions which are activated for each of the 5 senses. Looks like we have a question. Let's take a look here. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's just you guys talking to each other. So the five senses is the main thing that we talked about in chapter 5. For chapter 6, we're now more on the perception side of things, the interpretation, those later brain regions, more on the top-down side of things. So whereas chapter 5 was kind of like, how does our brain represent kind of the pieces of the world? How does our brain in chapter 5 kind of take in the data, which is out in the world? Chapter 6 is kind of more about how does the brain, how does our mind form whole entire objects? How does our brain create meaning out of that data? So I showed you this stuff last time, just reminding you chapter 5, more on the bottom up sensory driven piece by piece analysis. Chapter 6, what we're doing here, object recognition, object perception, more on the top down side of things. It's about your brain making inferences. It's about the knowledge that you possess in your mind and how that influences the way you interpret the data which is coming into your five senses. That's the example of bottom up processing that I've talked about 2 or 3 times already now. Here's the example of top down processing. And I'll remind you, I know I did this last time, but it's important. If you're looking at just this thing, if you're using bottom-up processing alone, that is, if you're breaking down this shape, let's just focus on one. You're breaking down this shape into its pieces, and then you're kind of trying to assemble those pieces together to form some type of a whole using a strategy only of bottom-up processing. This object is ambiguous. That is, there's the right answer is not clear. You don't actually know what it is this thing is if you're using just bottom-up processing, because this thing shares properties of 2 different objects, 2 different letters, A and H. But when you provide context, that allows you to use knowledge that you already have in your head to make an inference. And that inference is, oh, this must be an H. And here, this must be an A, because you're using knowledge, specifically knowledge of how to spell words in the English language. So I think this is about where we left off. The what and where pathways, also known as ventral and dorsal pathways, or ventral and dorsal streams. This is a focus, these 2 pathways, mostly on research, visual research. So I've mentioned before, in chapter 5, we talked about all 5 senses, but there's kind of just more research on the visual system. And so in this chapter, we'll talk a little bit about auditory, but really when we're talking about interpretation, perception, the top-down side of things, as in chapter 6, there's just way more research in the visual system and to some extent the auditory system. So we'll be talking about perception, object recognition, mostly by focusing in on the visual system. And V1 is the primary visual cortex, which is part of the occipital lobe. And we have talked about other brain regions in chapter 5. In fact, we talked about V4. V4 is a region which is kind of lateral. It's right next to V1, but it's kind of to the side. V1 is right in the middle of the occipital lobe. But then visual information kind of starts sending to the sides of the brain, kind of in this direction. Right next to V1 in each hemisphere is V4, which is a relatively later brain region. And then after V4, there's other later visual regions, which are part of this lobe, the temporal lobe. So I was doing it in my own head, but now I'll kind of do the same thing on this brain. Visual information, some visual information starts here in V1, primary visual cortex. And then it's sent along this pathway right here, the ventral pathway, or the what pathway. This includes V4. So V4 would be about like right here or so, V1 to V4. And then there's a bunch of other brain regions here. These are all relatively later brain regions. V1 is early because it's the first cortical area, which is activated for vision. But from there, that's just kind of the beginning of the process. That's like sensation is kind of, occurs in V1 or is about finished in V1. And then the information is sent to other parts of the brain, which is where more of the perceptual interpretation type of processes are involved. And so some of that information is sent along the temporal lobe, including V4. And that's the ventral or what pathway, which I think I've mentioned previously. That is a pathway which is really important for object recognition, object perception. That is some ways to kind of define object recognition perception. It's kind of like if you see an object, you know the name of that object. You can say, this is a magnifying glass. You can say things like that. And you can say, using that's the what pathway, identifying what it is. It is magnifying glass. And a part of the what pathway as well is being able to describe the function of a given thing. So those are kind of the two things I really think of when I think of the what pathway or the ventral pathway. I think of the name of an object and being able to describe what it is that object is for. For magnifying glass, obviously, it takes really small things and make them look bigger so you can see things that normally with the naked eye you would not be able to see. So that is the what pathway for naming objects and describing what they're for. And it starts in the occipital lobe, goes laterally, meaning to the side, and then ends up here in the temporal lobe. And there is some evidence, by the way, that there's a pathway right here. I'll show you, called the uncinate fasciculus, which sends some of that information to the frontal lobe, or information to the knowledge in the frontal lobe might influence the way that things are activated here. There's clearly some connection between the frontal and temporal lobe, and it's probably a little bit of both. The temporal lobe is activating, the temporal lobe sends signals to the frontal lobe, and kind of simultaneously the frontal lobe is sending signals to the temporal lobe. So there's kind of this pathway, but there's also this like feedback loop thing right here. That's the ventral what pathway. The other pathway, called the dorsal stream, or the dorsal pathway, or the where pathway, it starts in primary visual cortex, V1, and then it heads up north, or superior, up, from occipital lobe, V1, primary visual cortex, up to the parietal lobe right here. And then eventually that information makes its way to the frontal lobe. Of course, it's kind of similar, that there's probably kind of like feedback loops right here as well. So the signal sent up to the parietal lobe, and some of that signal continues onto the frontal lobe. But kind of simultaneously, the frontal lobe, where some of the knowledge that you already possess seems to be stored, is also probably sending signals to the parietal lobe, which is influencing the way the parietal lobe kind of takes in the information which is coming from V1. So you can mostly think about the direction of like activation going this way, but there is like this feedback thing, which appears to be going simultaneously, just like with the ventral pathway, where the frontal lobe is sending signals here as their signals from V1 are being sent up to the parietal lobe. So you can kind of think there's signals from the frontal lobe converging on the parietal lobe, and then signals from V1 from primary visual cortex are also converging on the parietal lobe. And so this is the dorsal or where pathway, and it's involved with two main things. What we're still talking about, how does our mind understand objects, recognize objects? And the basic idea here is that these two pathways process different aspects of an object. The where dorsal pathway is particularly involved, I think I did mention this last time, so it's a little bit of repetition, spatial perception, or being able to identify where in space a given object is. And kind of the reason for that is it's thought that this is a part of the brain that allows you to represent where in space things are, so that I can act in the direction where that thing is. So if I might need to adjust the microphone, I can reach right here and I can touch it and, move the microphone. I can act in the direction of the microphone, or, grabbing my phone, or grabbing the magnifying glass that I did earlier. All of those things are represented in space, and I need to be able to represent where those things are so that I can reach for them or act with them somehow. So that's the where pathway, the spatial perception part, where things are located for the purpose of acting or using those objects that are out in space in different points. And a related function, which is related to a term, which I did ask you about for this quiz for this one, related to a term called kinesthetic codes, which we'll talk more about later today probably. This idea that the motor system is represented in the dorsal pathway. So what I mean the motor system is that for many objects, there is kind of a set of knowledge that you have about how you use your body to use that object. So for instance, when I see this magnifying glass right here, I kind of, part of my brain kind of imagines motorically what I do with the magnifying glass when I use it. And that is the motor thing that I do with the magnifying glass is, I hold it up to my eye and I look through it like this. That's kind of like what my motor system does. Take my hand up to my eye and look through the magnifying glass up close to my eye. That's kind of what my motor system does. The idea is that the dorsal pathway also represents information about like what your motor system does with something, how you use that thing motorically. And just please note the differences between the what and where pathways. The what is mostly interested, I said, of naming an object, being able to describe in words what that object does. Whereas the where pathway, it's about representing where something is in space so that you can act with that thing. You can use that thing to act or, reach for it, for instance. But it's also about it's also about having a representation of those, of the way you move when you are using a given object. So please just note that, yeah, I would say that the where pathway is more about the motor system, how you interact with something. Whereas the what pathway is more about like linguistic knowledge of something, being able to provide a name and describe it with words. We will definitely have more examples here. Oh yeah, so first though, here is some pictures of like the white matter pathways in the brain. I already named these for you, but I'll do it again, even though you're not going to have to, well, you're probably not going to have to be able to know these anatomically. I don't think I'm going to require that, but it's cool. I think these things are neat. These are white matter pathways in the brain. So this is kind of like, you can kind of think of this as kind of like the underlying skeletal structure, of connections in the brain. This white matter pathway right here, the textbook calls it superior longitudinal fasciculus, which is a right name, but it's also called the arcuate fasciculus. And it seems to be connected, I'll draw it like it's about right here to right here. This is about where the arcuate fasciculus is. It goes from around the occipital lobe up to the parietal, maybe all the way up to the frontal lobe. So it kind of traces the arcuate fasciculus, the where pathway. And then there's this other one, which is inferior, which is below the arcuate fasciculus. This one right here, the uncinate fasciculus. I don't think they actually name it in the textbook. But the uncinate fasciculus, this appears to connect the temporal lobes, right here. This is the uncinate fasciculus is about right here, and then it projects up to the temporal lobe. So what's interesting about these two pathways is there is some kind of underlying connection structures in the brain which map on pretty closely to these. The arcuate fasciculus maps on pretty closely to the dorsal where pathway, whereas the uncinate fasciculus maps on pretty closely to the what pathway, the ventral pathway. So I'm going to present lots of evidence now in support of these two different pathways. So the evidence for this a lot of it actually comes from animal studies. There's also some research on humans, and both kind of converge on this idea that we do have these two different pathways. So some really early research, which is talked about in your textbook, comes from studies on monkeys. And they were lesion studies. Remember, you can do studies with animals where you just lesion their brain and see how their behavior changes, where in humans, you can't purposely lesion a brain. And so they did two different conditions. In one condition, the monkeys had bilateral temporal lobe lesions. So the temporal lobe would be, well, maybe I want to see if you guys actually remember this. This is not a bad little practice. Which pathway involves the temporal lobe? Go ahead and write it in the chat. Which pathway involves the temporal lobe? See if you can do it by memory, but if you have to look in your notes, that's fine. Which pathway out of those two involves the temporal lobe? Go ahead and write it in the chat there. I'll give you guys about 5 to 10 seconds. Which pathway involves the temporal lobe? There we go. Let's take a look. Yep, mostly ventral, and that is the what pathway. So it looks like we're getting this. Yep, ventral what. Good. So in this study, basically, they lesioned the ventral pathway, basically, the temporal lobe, part of the ventral pathway in both hemispheres. Bilateral means in both hemispheres. And they wanted to see how does this influence the animal's performance on different types of tasks. And what they found in this particular study, they had like a shape differentiation task, which is basically the animal had to indicate, they train the animals to indicate like what type of a shape they're seeing. So like the animal will touch one button if they see a circle, they'll touch like another button if they see a triangle type of thing. And the animals actually can be, when their brains are intact, they can actually be pretty good at this. They can see one shape and then they can identify by pressing a button. They can't speak, but they can identify by pressing a button what type of shape they're looking at. But after they have these bilateral ventral pathway lesions, their performance in this task declined. And so this would be considered a type of object recognition, object perception task. They cannot identify the shapes. They cannot name the shapes by pushing a button when their ventral pathway is lesioned in both hemispheres. But the other group they had their parietal lobes lesioned. And so the parietal lobe is part of the dorsal wear pathway, the one that goes up. The parietal lobe is above the occipital lobe. And they wanted to see how was their behavior influenced when they had bilateral dorsal pathway, bilateral wear pathway lesions. And these animals had difficulty with a wear task. So this is like a spatial perception task, a task where something along the lines of the animals see things that are in different points in space, and then they think they disappear, and then the animals have to indicate where the thing that they just saw had appeared, maybe by touching a button on or touching a part of a screen or some type of way that they had the animal indicate where something had just appeared. The animals were fine at this task when their brains were intact, but after their parietal lobe, their dorsal pathways were lesioned, their performance in this kind of spatial perception task, remembering where things were in space, was impaired. So there's this double dissociation, or just a dissociation between these brain regions and their function, such that the temporal lobe lesions appear to impair shape differentiation, which is a type of object recognition, object perception task. But their spatial performance, the bilateral temporal lobe lesions, their wear task performance was fine. So this temporal lobe lesions impaired the object recognition, the shape differentiation, but the wear, that is the spatial perception, was fine. But the opposite was true over here for the dorsal pathway, the parietal lobe group, where they had bilateral dorsal or wear pathway lesions. They were not able to indicate, they performed poorly on the spatial perception task, the wear task, but they were fine. Their performance was fine in the object recognition, that is the shape differentiation. So this supports the exact theory I was just talking about, the dorsal ventral theory. The ventral pathway is important for object recognition and object perception. It's not that important for spatial perception. The dorsal pathway is important for spatial perception, but it's not that important for object recognition. That's exactly what these findings are purported to suggest. So there's more evidence here. So this is evidence from cats. They're kind of doing lesion studies again, but this is a different type of lesion, where instead of just like, sometimes with lesions, they'll give you like a shot, or they'll give the animal a shot of a chemical which will basically destroy the brain tissue, like a neurotoxin. Sometimes they'll just physically remove parts of the brain. Presumably another strategy, which I haven't seen too much studies like this, but it seems quite plausible, is cooling parts of the brain. So presumably if you cool parts of the brain, it slows down the functions, basically kind of temporarily, or it can turn off basically parts of the brain. You cool specific parts of the brain, and then you see how behavior changes when those different parts of the brain are cooled. They did it in cats. The one thing that this thing which is interesting about this study is they were using auditory stimuli instead. So I said this chapter is mostly about visual, but this one was about auditory. It's kind of important because the main theories that exist right now suggest that the ventral and dorsal pathways aren't just visual. They are visual and they are auditory. So what this means is that for the auditory system, there is objects that we can recognize. But for the auditory system, there's also, aware component. Like we can localize where sounds are coming from. Presumably that uses the dorsal aware pathway. But there is also recognizing what it is that we're hearing, being able to say that is a blank that I'm hearing, which presumably involves the ventral pathway, the what pathway. And the evidence for this, some of it, there's actually lots of evidence, but the evidence presented here comes from these cat studies. And I should point out that in cats, their brains are different enough from humans that it's not entirely clear. They don't really have the clear dorsal ventral pathways like humans and to some extent monkeys have. And so the textbook was pretty careful. They didn't actually say that the dorsal or ventral pathway was lesion. They called it anterior and posterior regions. And the anterior was thought to represent the ventral what pathway. So when I say anterior here, you can kind of think of this as like the temporal lobe. But when I say posterior here, you can kind of think of this as the parietal lobe. And they once again find this kind of double dissociation. When the anterior parts were lesions, their ability to do a sound discrimination task was impaired. So basically you can think of this, I believe it was like a melody type of task. The animals would hear like a series of tones. And if they heard one series of tone, they have to press one button. If they hear a different series of tone, they have to press another button, or they have to like somehow indicate which melody they're hearing. I mean, they can teach the animals how to basically respond. When the animals are intact, they can tell which melody they're hearing. So you can think of it like a melody would be a type of object. Like when you hear the melody to a Green Day song, that's one object. When you hear a melody to a Lady Gaga song, that's another object. And they're basically having the cats kind of have to differentiate which melody are you hearing. Press A for Green Day, press B for Lady Gaga. And it wasn't exactly like that for the cats, but it was along those lines. When the anterior regions, which correspond roughly to the ventral or what pathway, were cooled, the animals had difficulty knowing which melody, which sounds they were hearing. They could not name by pressing a button or somehow responding to identify the melody that they were hearing. But their localization was okay. So the localization would be something along the lines of those melodies can be occurring from different speakers, which are out there. And the animal somehow has to indicate where that sound was coming from. So when their ventral kind of area, the anterior region was lesioned, they couldn't name melodies, so to speak. They couldn't name the sounds by giving some type of response, but they're knowing where those melodies were coming from, where the sounds were coming from was fine. Just the opposite when they're posterior, which is kind of corresponds to the dorsal or the where pathways. When this was lesioned, they had trouble with localization, but they were fine at naming or discriminating, identifying the different sounds, the different melodies that they were hearing. So once again, we kind of find the same dissociation here between object discrimination, or you could call it object recognition, object identification. Those are all kind of synonyms right here. That involves the anterior, the ventral, what pathway, versus localization, which is like spatial perception, involves the dorsal where pathway, or here they call it the posterior part of the brain. Any questions or comments about these two lesion studies, the ones with monkeys and the one with cats? Okay. So I've given you two pieces of evidence from animals, but of course, really the main thing that we're interested in is humans. And so, but of course, with humans, you can't do those types of lesion studies where you will remove part of the brain or, give a neurotoxin to the ventral pathway or something like that, or cool. You can't do a surgery and then, put some type of thing will cool the brain of humans. That's just too invasive. And so with humans, you can't do those type of causal type of studies where you actually manipulate the integrity of different parts of the brain and see how behavior changes. Instead, with humans, you use neuroimaging. We talked a lot about this now. Chapter 3 was all about the different methods, and we talked about lesion method, which can be used for animals. or imaging methods, which are useful for humans because imaging methods are not very invasive at all. So that's what this is. And I will say, I will definitely include one question on the test about this, about this study. And I will also mention it's a study which it's a little bit hard for students. So I'll go over some today, and I'll probably go over it again next class. So this was a study where they had people looking, so it's a visual task once again. They had people looking at stimuli, and it was actually the same stimuli. It was like a set of objects. And the people would have to kind of look at the beginning of each trial at the objects, and they'd have to remember one of two different things. On half the trials, the people would have to remember what the objects are that they're looking at. So imagine there's an array of like 3 different things you're looking at, like on a computer screen. And your job as the person is just to remember the names of those 3 things. So for instance, you might see a display with a wine glass, a jacket, and an airplane, and they're in different points in space. And if you are in like the what condition or the object recognition condition, you see those things briefly and then they go away. You have to wait a bit. And then the researcher will say, okay, what were the things that you just saw? And you have to say back to the researcher, wine glass, jacket, airplane. This is a task. Well, actually, this is something, yeah, I'll see if you guys can infer what the hypothesis should be based on the dorsal ventral pathway distinction. That is the where and what pathways. What corresponds to ventral, the where corresponds to dorsal. Which of those 2 pathways should be used if you're having to remember the names of objects that you just saw? Which of those 2 pathways would you hypothesize based on this ventral, dorsal, what, where distinction? Which of those 2 pathways should you be using if you have to name the objects that you just saw? Yeah, good. Ventral. I'm seeing all ventrals so far. Good. I'm seeing lots of that. The ventral pathway, that would be the hypothesis that I would form. And by the way, the evidence does support that somewhat. And I'll get to the findings of this in a second, but that's good. Your intuitions here seem to be in the right direction. So the hypothesis is in the what condition. That is where you have to name these. That should involve the ventral pathway. There's another condition though, where you're looking at the same things. You'll be looking at 3 different objects and they appear in different points in space, but your job is not to remember the names of those things that you just saw. They appear in space and then they disappear. In the other condition, which I call like the where condition or the spatial location condition, you don't remember the names of those things that appeared on the screen. Instead, you have to remember where they were when they occurred. Sorry, I got a question. And in this study, brain activity was measured using a PET scan. Yes. PET is the one that involves a radioactive tracer. So yeah, good question about that. This is like fMRI, but it uses the radioactive tracer and you get those activation patterns. I mean, those activation patterns represent blood flow or metabolic activity. That's what PET scans do. And so for the where condition, where you see things and then they disappear, and you have to indicate where did those things occur? Where in space did those things occur? So please note, in both conditions, you're looking at the same things, but in one condition, you're asked to attend to the names of those things. In another condition, you'll see those same things, but you don't have to pay attention to the names of those things. Instead, you just need to remember where did, whatever that it is that occurred, where was it on the screen? So we have a what condition where you're paying attention to the what, the name, and another condition where you're seeing the same stuff, but you're paying attention to where, the spatial location of those things. And the second condition, the where one, presumably would involve the dorsal, that is the where pathway, the one that involves the parietal lobe. And I kind of have the findings right here, but so you can use those verbally, that's like the verbal answer, but I have the pictures right here. So these are like the 2 main conditions. Oh, so they call them, so this is, they call it position. So that's like the where task. And then the object task is where you have to like name it, where you name the thing. So the position what they call the position, I was calling like the where task or the spatial location task. That's what they call position. And then that the object is where you have to name the thing. And so what this brain represents, this is, I've told you before, but in case you forgot, whenever you're seeing a brain like this with little colors, these colors always represent difference scores, the differences in activation between two conditions. Those regions of the brain that are activated here are those regions of the brain that showed significantly more activation in the where condition compared to the what condition. That is, the regions of the brain that showed more activation when you're having to pay attention to the position, the where of the things, compared to with the names of those objects. So these are the regions of the brain. And they do show a tiny bit of what I would call like ventral pathway activation here. So it's a little bit weird, but they do show right here. This is pretty clearly part of the dorsal pathway. And the way I like to see this one is I kind of see this as like part of that increasing, like that up kind of pattern. So like, remember the primary visual cortex starts right here. And then for the dorsal pathway, it kind of goes up like this. And I see that as like the beginning of like a line right there. So those little two activations are part of the dorsal pathway. At least that's how the authors interpreted it right here, starting the primary visual cortex, but then goes up. And there is, I mean, this is part of the temporal lobe. It's kind of unexpected, but right here, that's pretty clearly part of the dorsal. That's part of the parietal lobe right here. And you can kind of see this like line, which is headed up. And then they do show some frontal lobe activation as well. So you kind of see this as part of a line, occipital, and then up to the parietal, and then eventually ending in the frontal lobe. These are the regions of the brain that showed more activation in the where condition. On the other hand, in the other condition, so this is the opposite. These are still different scores we're seeing here, but these now are the regions of the brain that showed more activation for the what condition, that is naming the objects rather than having to remember where they are. So the object minus position, or the what minus where. Regions of the brain that showed more activation for the what condition. And this one's probably the most clear. This is kind of a weird, this is like a medial slice of the brain, which is a little bit hard. It's like taking the brain, cutting in half, and then looking in to the brain. It's a little bit harder to imagine, but there's definitely some ventral pathway activation there. It's even more clear if you look at it right here. This is quite clearly the ventral pathway. Starts in the occipital lobe and it stays low, and then it extends to the ventral pathway, the temporal lobe, which is right here. So these roughly correspond to the dorsal and ventral pathways. In conclusion, the where task mostly involved the dorsal parietal lobe, the where pathway. The what task, which they call the object task, involved mostly the ventral pathway right here. And this is a PET study. We have some chats of these old. Do patients with dementia usually have trouble with ventral pathway tasks? It depends on the type of dementia, I would imagine. Well, okay, so if you're saying dementia, I assume you mean like memory impairments is usually what people mean by dementia. And yes, I think that seems pretty true. For instance, a lot of dementia is caused by like issues with the hippocampus, which is part of the ventral pathway. People with dementia oftentimes will have problems with naming objects and being able to describe what they do. And an interesting thing that I've at least heard is that, for instance, individuals with Alzheimer's, they will not be able to like remember, specific facts or be able to name things, but they can still perform actions. And we talked about how the dorsal pathway, the where pathway, is also important for interacting with the object, like with your motoric system. And there's definitely, actually, I think quite a bit of evidence that individuals with Alzheimer's disease, if you ask them, can you play a musical instrument? They might be saying, no, I can't. I've never played a musical instrument. Or they might not even really understand the question that you're asking because their language skills are so, they have problems with language skills. But if you sit a person with musical expertise in front of a piano, if they had musical training on the piano or whatever before their dementia hit, and then you put it in front of the piano, they can actually play it just fine. So that's an interesting separation. Individuals with dementia will have troubles like remembering the name of a piano, or they might not remember that they know how to play piano. Those are things that require kind of the ventral pathway to know, or they might not even be able to say what a piano does. What is the purpose of piano? A person with dementia might not be able to explain it because their what pathways probably not working too well, but their dorsal pathway, the parietal lobe, still works okay. And so they can play the piano just fine. They don't realize it until they sit up there, and then all of a sudden they can start playing it because their body remembers how to do the thing, even though the other part of their brain doesn't remember what the thing is called, or they're not able to explain what a piano is for. So that's, yeah, that question's cool. Let's see, has the ventral pathway itself been located within the temporal lobe, or did they just measure temporal lobe activity in general? The reason why people think there's converging evidence which suggests that the ventral pathway involves the temporal lobe. The main evidence comes from lesion studies, which I talked about earlier. When the temporal lobe is damaged, that's when you are most likely to have what problems? Problems identifying the name of something or being able to describe what that thing does. So they infer that there's a pathway there based on when there's lesions to the temporal lobe. That's when you're likely to have problems with identifying the what. Also, that white matter pathway that I showed you, the uncinate fasciculus, which is there, that seems to be kind of the anatomical structure, the anatomical skeleton, so to speak, of the what pathway. So that's why they believe there's a pathway there. One, they see the white matter pathway that's underneath the surface. And two, when you have lesion studies to the temporal lobe, those are the ones that are most likely to cause problems with what. Okay, so moving on, once again, dorsal pathway for the where task, ventral pathway for the what task. So yeah, here is a really, really interesting, I think one of the most interesting things about this chapter. This is where I'm getting to the idea of kinesthetic codes. Do I actually write the word kinesthetic code here? Yeah, I do right there, kinesthetic code. These two slides have to do with kinesthetic code. And I did change the order of some of these slides that seemed, I updated the slides before class. So if you're using last week's slide, the order right here might be a tiny bit different, but it made sense more if I kind of changed it so all the things on kinesthetic codes were right next to each other. So that's what I'm talking about here. So we're talking about the motor system and how the motor system can be involved with object recognition. So this might seem weird at first because, well, when we've talked about the motor system so far for this dorsal ventral pathway, the motor system has mostly been involved with the where pathway, the dorsal stream, the dorsal pathway that involves the parietal lobe. That's the one which is most highly connected to the motor system. But when we've been talking about object recognition, we've been mostly talking about the what pathway, the temporal lobe. So that's what's kind of interesting about this idea of kinesthetic codes, which I'm getting at here, is that the motor system, which is part of the dorsal where pathway, is connected to those parts of the brain, that is the ventral pathway, in such a way that that motor knowledge that you have about how to interact with an object, that motor knowledge can be sent to the ventral pathway, to the temporal lobe. So you can have motor knowledge from the parietal lobe, from the dorsal pathway, which is sent to the what pathway, the ventral pathway, to help you perform object recognition tasks. So there's a couple, let's see, I'm gonna make sure. Yeah, so I have a couple examples of this. Maybe I'll start talking first about the one which I believe is mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. So there's that individual who was shown, he was shown something. It was like a rotary type of thing, and it had a bunch of numbers on it. And when he saw the thing, he said, oh, because this is an individual, and the example in the textbook is an individual who had a condition where he could not, he or she, I don't remember if it's a he or she, where he could not name objects. So he'd see things and he would have trouble recognizing them. Remember when I said object recognition, the two main aspects of object recognition are being able to name something and be able to describe what it does. In this one anecdote in the textbook, there's this individual who was shown something. It was like a circular looking thing with numbers all over it. And the individual was having trouble naming it, which means he's having trouble recognizing what the thing was. Eventually, he comes up with a guess because the researchers were really prodding him, please give us at least a guess. And the guy said, or the person said, I think it's part of a phone, which is the wrong answer. And the researchers kept saying, let's try a different guess. and he's having really struggling because all he could think of, oh, I just know it's a rotary dial for a phone. It's part of a phone. You guys might not know those, but back in the day, the way you'd have to dial is you'd have to like turn these little circular thing and you have to wait till it goes back and then you turn it again. Each number was like a different little thing you had to do on the phone. And that's presumably what the person thought, this patient thought, this little circular thing with numbers on. They thought it was part of an old rotary dial for a telephone, which is the incorrect answer. The researchers kept prodding him, okay, that's the nice guess, but that was not the correct answer. But he's just having trouble. But then at some point, he's looking closely at the thing that he was looking at, and they were really like, no, try again, think of something else. And he kind of unconsciously was looking at it, and he started doing this. And what he was doing when he was doing this motion was, even though his ventral pathway, his what pathway, was not able to name the object, it was not able to recognize the object, or was not able to describe what the object did, his motor system still kind of knew what it was supposed to do with the object. He couldn't name it. He couldn't say this is a blank, but which is part of the ventral what pathway. But the dorsal knowledge, the motor knowledge of the parietal lobe, that still seemed to be intact. So when he saw the thing, his body kind of unconsciously knew what you're supposed to do with this thing is this. And he kind of just started doing this little motion right here. And then at one point, supposedly, he looked at his hand and he's like, oh, I know what it is. Does anyone, I don't know. I'm curious to know if anyone remembers. Can anyone, either if you read it, can you tell me what it was that he actually saw? And once he started doing this, he was able to name the object. You could either read it or you could maybe infer what I'm trying to do right there with the rotary thing. Let's take a look. Yes, combination lock is correct. Good. Yeah, some people are getting that. It's a combination lock. So like that's one for, I think of like in lockers in junior high and high school, you have to move it to the right, move it to the left, and then move it to the right again. Then you can open your locker. And presumably that's what it was. And so this is a great illustration of kinesthetic codes helping a person with object recognition. He couldn't figure out that it was a combination lock using his what pathway by itself. The what pathway, for whatever reason in this individual, wasn't working that well. So he was having trouble naming the thing. Just looking at the thing, taking the visual information from the object, it goes into his eyes, then to his what pathway. The what pathway, it wasn't able to get the answer. But then, which is part of the temporal lobe, so I'm pointing here. The parietal lobe, which is part of the dorsal pathway up here, though, that was still getting information from the visual information just fine. And the dorsal pathway was basically telling the person what you do with this. This is what your muscles usually do. This is what your body does motorically when you see one of these things. Then he looked at his own hand and saw what his motor system was doing. And you can kind of imagine what's going on here is that the activation in the parietal lobe and the dorsal pathway about what the motor system does is being sent to the ventral pathway. There's information being sent from the parietal lobe to the ventral, from the parietal lobe to the dorsal path to the temporal lobe, from parietal to temporal, that is from dorsal to ventral. And that information about the motor system was helping the person was kind of helping the what pathway figure out what it was that it was looking at. So these two systems can kind of interact. Usually you think the dorsal or the where pathway is just about locating where the thing is in space or knowing how it is that you interact with that thing motorically. But the two systems, the two pathways are not perfectly separated. And the evidence, there's pretty good evidence that stuff, that those motor knowledge of the parietal, of the dorsal pathway, that can help object recognition through kinesthetic codes. That is, these motor knowledge that you have, which can be sent to the ventral pathway, the temporal lobe, to help you with object recognition, which is what I say, dorsal and ventral pathway can interact. The dorsal pathway, through kinesthetic codes, through motor knowledge, can assist with object recognition. Another example, and then I'll let us get going, of this type of sensory motor knowledge or kinesthetic codes would be scissors. So you could imagine an individual that has a problem with their what pathway. They have problems naming this. So they just see this right here. They just see the scissors right here, and they can't name what these things are. It looks like a foreign object to them. They can't explain what the scissors do. Verbally, the answers just aren't coming. But you can imagine the motor knowledge that you have of scissors, which would be something along the lines of this. In a person whose what pathway is not working well, the where pathway, the dorsal pathway, which houses the motor knowledge, should still work. And so you could imagine an individual that can't tell that scissors, can't say the answer scissors, but then they might kind of unconsciously start doing that same thing that the other guy was doing with the combination lock. And then might start doing the scissor motion, and then they see their own scissor motion, their hands will be like, oh, these are scissors, which would be another example of using motor knowledge of kinesthetic codes, which are represented in the dorsal pathway, presumably, to help you perform object recognition, which is something which is thought to rely on the what pathway, the ventral pathway. So we will start there next time. We'll kind of review some of this stuff on kinesthetic codes. And then we're about halfway done with this chapter, I would say. So I will see you, let's see, that would be Wednesday. So I will stop recording now.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. See you later.